Quite a lot of what I'm going to say has been mentioned earlier on today, but I think it's probably quite useful to bring it together in the context of climate change. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change over the last 8 months have published their 5th assessment report. But if I had brought up a quote from that, you'd have said, well, they would say that anyway. So I've got a quote up there from the CEO of Unilever, who's making the point that actually politically and across businesses, we are getting nowhere in terms of cutting greenhouse gas emissions to meet the globally accepted and recognised maximum increase in temperature below or above which there's likely to be close to catastrophic climate change. At the moment we're running and we're going to be between 4 and 6 degrees above, not 2 degrees. So it's really making the point that climate change is a big issue. We can't keep forgetting about it, leaving it for another day. We've really got to start thinking about it, particularly in forestry, when we're looking at such long planning horizons, long times over which our actions will bear fruit. So it's really to make that point that we do need to start thinking about it. Just a very brief bit of policy background, not least to make the point that forestry isn't just sat in the background and ignored by DEFRA, ignored by government. There is an interest in how forestry is performing and how it is going to perform in the future. In 2012, the first UK climate change risk assessment was published. It's a requirement by Act of Parliament. And to be perfectly honest, it wasn't particularly helpful because forestry was split into 2 sector reports. There's the natural environment and there's forestry. And I think everyone in this room would say that continuous cover forestry is a combination of the 2. The good news is in the next climate change risk assessment, which will be published in 2017, they will be brought together into the agriculture and the natural environment. So the outdoors is going to be treated together, which I think will be much more effective. The main risks that were identified for the forestry sector were pests and diseases. It was just at the cusp of the likes of Killara and Phytophthora rearing their very ugly heads. So that was right, and it points to the future risks of pests and diseases, which I think is quite right. There were drought effects in southern England identified and changing tree suitability across much of the country. So those were the risks that were identified, but there were also opportunities identified, and I think we must bear that in mind in the forestry sector. It isn't all glass half empty. We need to look at what the opportunities are for us, for increased productivity in parts of the country, for a wider range of tree species. Quite a lot of evidence was published in 2009 in the Reid report, and it made a couple of key points. These were the 5 or 6 key points that were made coming out of this report. Firstly, an asset to be managed wisely, that's UK forests. Protect what we have, their carbon, their biodiversity, and the fact that climate change is already having an impact. Secondly, and probably most importantly in this context, the status quo is not an option. We can't just let it run. Action is needed now, and the future will not be the same as the past, so we really do need to start planning for climate change. On the back of the climate change risk assessment, again, by Act of Parliament, there was a requirement to publish a national adaptation programme, and for the forestry sector, the 3 objectives: to increase the resilience of the forestry sector by increasing the level of management in England's woodlands, picking up what Chris has just said, and the uptake of adaptation, good manage in woodland creation and in restocking. Secondly, to increase resilience to pests and diseases to help protect biodiversity and also maintain productivity in the agricultural sector. And finally, to embed climate change adaptation into agriculture, horticulture and forestry research programmes. So there you go, Gary. That's what government said is needed for forestry research. And also for the private sector forestry, at the time England's Woodland Timber Partnership committed to pull together an action plan for the private sector. Mike Seville is taking on that role at the moment, and we have got a workshop later in the month. So hopefully we will get a good action plan coming together from the private sector. Again, by Act of Parliament, the Committee on Climate Change have to report on progress and tell government when progress is not good enough. They published their progress report last year that focused on the natural environment and on forestry, and it was very, very difficult to find any indicators where the data were available. We did look at uptake of continuous cover forestry or alternative to clearfell, but there wasn't good enough data out there for us to be able to put in place an indicator that would be fit for the future. So the indicator that was settled on was actually the diversity of tree species delivered to forest enterprise for planting in England. And there's certainly been a marked change since 2005-06. So there's certainly diversification in tree species going on, not least because of the need to act with the impacts of pests and diseases on traditional tree species. Government's forestry policy statement was published last year. The only reason I've put that up is to highlight those two objectives: the protect, climate change and pests and diseases, and the economics of forestry. Resilient forestry has to be economically resilient as well as environmentally resilient. I think that point was well made by both Graham and Gary earlier on. So we need to ensure that the trees of the future continue to grow, because a tree that isn't growing is not going to be economically to manage. And we've got to make sure that those woodlands are economical to manage, otherwise they won't be managed and there will be a decline in biodiversity, as Chris has shown. So what is the problem that we've got ahead of us? Again, Gary mentioned ecological site classification. This is changing suitability of Sitka spruce in the middle of the century and towards the end of the century, or carrying on the rather regal theme. And sorry, Charles, I'm glad you're not here, but probably the reign of William V and the reign of George VII, if I've got my numbers right. Part of that is to say we don't know what's going to happen in the 2050s. It'll be in a 20-30 year block. There's a lot of uncertainty of the future, but we've still got to start thinking, start planning around that. So effectively, Sitka spruce, wherever it's brown, dropping down the suitability classes and increasing where it's green. And you can see this part of the world looking pretty good in the middle of the century, actually. Sitka spruce is likely to benefit from a little bit of climatic warming, still wet enough. Hopefully it'll stay dry this afternoon. But by the end of the century, the majority of England declining productivity. So that's the sort of thing we've got to look at for individual species. If you look across the whole of the public forest estate in England, in the absence of any adaptation, just doing like for like on the same sites, restocking, by the end of the century, under admittedly a fairly extreme climate scenario, 65% of the public forest estate would no longer be classed as suitable for commercial forestry. It doesn't mean that those woodlands will not survive, growing below what is currently considered to be an economically acceptable growth rate, but it does indicate the very large changes that are upon us if we don't change forestry practice. As far as the Northwest is concerned, it's even at the end of the century, under an extreme climate scenario, it's not looking too bad. We've got sufficient moisture, and as I say, the trees are likely to benefit. The majority of species are likely to benefit from increased warmth. However, if you look the other end of the country, in the southeast, a lot of the conifers, by the end of the century, just fall off a cliff in terms of productivity, and a number of the native species aren't looking too clever anyway. So we've got to start bearing that in mind. The trees may not die, but as I say, growth rates will decline significantly. And is that then an economically viable industry? Will woodland management just drop off? You can look at it another way. How fast do trees have to keep up with the level of climate change or the rate of climate change that's projected? It's not 40 miles an hour, 40 feet a day. That's a rule of thumb for how fast species will have to keep up with the rate of climate change. Now, a snail might just make 40 feet per day, but a tree with a generation time of 100 years won't. We could let nature take its course, and yes, evolution will work, reassemblage of species, genetic adaptation, but that might take 1,000 years. And if we're looking to maintain productive forestry in one form or another, that 1,000-year period is too long. We need to be thinking what the next generation are going to be harvesting, what the next generation are going to be growing. Gary and Tor Stokes, who's somewhere in the audience, produced a very good report outlining the pros and cons of continuous cover forestry in terms of climate change adaptation. It picked out the many benefits, but also the disbenefits. For example, increased risk of forest fires because of ladder fuels. So a very, very useful assessment of the pros and the cons. But my question is CCF, continuous cover forestry, enough on its own? If your glass is half full, and please note it's a plastic cup to note government cutbacks. If your glass is half full, and I think that is the approach, certainly in wider government. Oh yes, it's an adaptation option, continuous cover forestry, box ticked, that's great. Structural diversity, yep, supports biodiversity, more wind firm, the next cohort is present, regeneration, opportunity for annual recruitment, so you're not putting all your eggs into one basket, so if you've got a dry spring, you don't lose everything, that's great. A less hostile microclimate for regeneration. In terms of resilience, species diversity, yep, great. Reduce risk from pest and disease outbreak, a more natural system. And adaptation in the longer term is also supported through evolutionary adaptation, letting nature take its course. However, if you look from the other end of the plastic cup and ask the questions, are the species on the site right? If not, are you going to enrich the species diversity? Are you going to change the species on the site? Is the genetic material right? Is it there for nature to work with? You need to ask these questions. Nature will adapt, but will it be quick enough to answer the economic side of resilience and ensure that you have got a functioning industry within that woodland? Is the risks from windstorms acceptable if you're continuing to grow high forest rather than some of the more dubious sites that Graham was talking about, where shorter rotation to keep the tree height down? Now, what are the risks? What about the wildfire risk and ladder fires? And have you considered changes to the forest infrastructure, the culverts, the roads, the paths? Just saying, CCF, we've ticked the box, probably isn't enough. What it needs is the rest of the UK Forestry Standard, all the thinking associated with that applying at the same time. This is from the Forest and Climate Change Guidelines, and Graham didn't mention in his talk that he actually chaired the working group that put those together. And there's a lot around forest planning, adaptive management, tree and shrub species selection, landscape ecology, and environmental protection. There are a lot of aspects of climate change within those climate change guidelines. But the UK Forestry Standard on its own, with its 8 volumes and 8 inches of thickness, can be quite daunting. particularly picking out the straightforward messages about climate change adaptation. There are some important ones, including consider alternatives to clear fell systems such as continuous cover forestry. There are some clear messages in there, but not all of it is quite as clear, and simple messages, I think, are what are needed. So I've put 5 up here. Woodland design and contingency planning. Understand the climate change projections. Create fire, windstorm and flood contingency plans. Most importantly, monitor and review what works and doesn't work. We're a long-term industry and we need to bear that in mind. Bring existing woodlands into management, manage deer, squirrels, invasive species, thin to encourage regeneration, enrichment planting, if necessary, to diversify species. Adapt choice of planting material, understanding site and soils, and diversify the species on the site, including using the minor species that have been managed out, as Chris has mentioned. Small leaf lime, hornbeam, whitebeam. There's a lot of native species that we just don't use. Gary has mentioned genetic diversity here, and also got transformed continuous cover forestry. And then there are landscape approaches, which is outside the scope of this conference. Gary mentioned provenance. Here's a provenance trial in Andover. All were planted at the same time. As you can see, the provenance on the left-hand side from eastern Scotland growing very, very, very poorly. The best of the provenances was from Slovenia. So there's that genetic variability that we have hardly touched on and represents a real resource to help us adapt to climate change. If you think about the native range of ash, it's growing in a lot of conditions, and in the absence of Callara, we could do so much with that. And that is the same for the vast majority of native species, a huge genetic range, a huge genetic resource. And if you think of what agriculturalists have done, agronomists have done with breeding the likes of wheat, we really haven't touched the surface. Again, Gary mentioned Douglas fir, and he had a much prettier map on it. But for our commercial species, again, we have the same. It's not right to mess with the genetics in all circumstances, and Keith Kirby published a very good paper last year that identified where it was right to expand the genetic diversity and where it wasn't. So that's certainly well worth looking at if you're considering introducing provenances from afar. There's also the alternative and native species. Gary's mentioned the Reed report. This time I've got a prettier table than his. We've got a range of conifers, some of which have been planted frequently in the past. A number, Abies alba, one of them, where looking to be really good potential, including Atlas cedar as well, and Cryptomeria. So a range of species that we have got some good information about. There are also a range of European species, and if we're looking at long-term climate change, how do those redistribute themselves within Europe? I think there's a case to look at those as well. Just a few pretty photographs. A lot of them I think Scott Wilson took. Serbian spruce and oriental spruce, good potential. The redwoods, again, I think they've been forgotten in the past and may have really good potential. And the European firs. And also near-native broadleaves. We probably don't need to introduce them now, but we may at some point in the future. Oriental beech is there, downy birch, and flowering ash, Fraxinus ornus. I gather that's relatively resistant to Callara, so maybe something to think about. Looking further globally, a resource that we may exploit. This is a climate change matching exercise where in the country has a similar monthly temperature distribution as we do in the UK. And you can see quite a few of our hotspots for tree exploring in the past. And the location of the likes of Douglas are picked up there. If you take it forward towards the end of the century, A very, very different distribution, the Mediterranean, but also broad tracts through southern China and also the southeastern United States. South American peninsula moved a long way north, and you can see down in Australasia moved a long way north. So we have got areas to explore, and this may give an indication if we do need to further diversify the species. Gary's mentioned ecological site classification. It is a great tool. Go and use it. It allows you to put in detailed information for the site. Like any model, garbage in, garbage out, and the underlying soil maps are far from perfect. But if you dig a soil pit, put the soil information in, it will give you a good indication in simple terms as to which species should perform well in the future. It includes a marginal category now to reflect that timber production isn't the only thing you need out of a woodland, and in a semi-natural woodland, species classed as marginal will be absolutely fine, hopefully. Maps are about to go up on the website that show how this looks. This happens to be for Wellingtonia. It's the only one that is there at the moment, which is the reason I've put it up. But it does give a good spatial representation of how the productivity of Wellingtonia is likely to change as we move through the century. A lot of guidance is there, both on FR's web pages and also Forestry Commission England's web pages. And today, Natural England published an adaptation manual, which includes habitat-specific worksheets, advice on what adaptation options are appropriate for all the priority woodland habitats and all the other priority habitats. Really good resource, so do have a look. And it's not restricted to one or two actions. Those are the actions for existing on the left and new plantings for the lowland broadleaf priority woodland, including conversion to continuous cover forestry. So just summing up, I'd say continuous cover forestry is part of the solution, but just saying we're adopting continuous cover forestry is not enough. You need to go through all the other planning processes, all the other thought processes associated with climate change adaptation. Thanks very much.